Hi, my name is Tanya Notley. I'm a digital media researcher and producer, and in this lecture pod, I'll be talking about women and the news. To do this, I ask, how are women represented in news media, both globally and in Australia? After looking at the facts, the most recent data, I want to consider, so what? What does women's representation in the news mean? Why does it really matter? This is a topic I have a personal research interest in. In 2017, I designed Australia's first ever national survey to examine young Australians' experience of news media. We surveyed 1,000 young Australians aged 8 to 16 years, and one of the questions we asked them is, do you think news media treats men and women equally? What we found is that many young people do not believe this is the case. Overall, 40% of young Australians believe men and women are treated equally fair in the news media, while 27% think this is not the case and 33% stated they don't know, which suggests either that they've not thought about the topic or they just don't feel that they're able to judge the situation. When we drilled down into the data, we found that boys feel more strongly than girls that women are treated fairly. Teen girls were most likely to perceive bias in news reporting, with 41% stating men and women are not treated equally fair by news media. So isn't it interesting that so many young Australians perceive that news media does not treat men and women equally? It's also telling that girls perceive this bias more than boys do. But is it true? Do the news media really treat men and women so differently? The Global Media Monitoring Project is the largest and longest-running longitudinal study on the representation of women in the news. Every 5 years since 1995, volunteers from around the world use the project's methodology to examine this topic in their own country. The way they do it is that they select one day to examine women's representation and participation across all major news media channels. They capture all the news media and then they do the analysis. They look at how many reporters were women, how many news presenters are women, and they look at how many women are cited as experts and for what topics. The last global study took place in 2015 and over 100 countries were analysed. Here is what the analysis revealed. Overall, women make up only 24% of the persons heard, read about or seen in newspaper, television and radio news, with no changes made overall to this figure since 2010. And if you think the internet might have changed things, this just does not hold up against the data. Only 26% of the people in internet news stories and media news tweets combined are women. So there is really no significant difference between traditional and online news in terms of the inclusion of women. When it comes to the topic of news, women are most included in science and health fares best, with 35% of these stories including women, while news on politics and government is appalling in terms of gender equality. Less than 20% of these stories include women. The picture becomes much worse if we look at women's inclusion in news stories and break down why they are included. Are they there to share a personal experience, to speak as eyewitnesses, or are they there as the expert? Unfortunately, when it comes to including experts on the news, 19% are female and 81% are male. Even when it comes to eyewitness accounts of crime, 30% are female and 70% are male, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. While an argument might be able to be made about why women are less represented in stories about politics, since there are generally fewer politicians who are women, surely males are not this overrepresented as witnesses of crime. It defies logic and it helps us to ask questions about why these biases exist and indeed why they persist. The greatest gender equality looking across all countries is seen when it comes to women presenting the news. The figures for reporting, though, are much worse. Just 35% of newspaper reporters are women, for example, and in TV, women are far more likely to be presenters rather than the reporters. You might be wondering if things are better in Australia. Well, there is no specific report for Australia on the Global Media Monitoring Project, so I requested via the website if I could have access to all of the data for all countries, which they provided. Examining the Australian data, I found that while we do have more equality in terms of women as news reporters. We also have slightly more women appearing on the news generally when compared with all other countries included in the study. Unfortunately, though, we fare much worse when it comes to including women as experts. When experts appear on Australian news media, they are women less than 15% of the time. Given that women represent half of the Australian population, why is it that men's voices are way overrepresented in the news? How can this possibly be justified or indeed explained? But most importantly, what impact does it have? I would argue that there are three key impacts. The first is that we get an imbalanced picture of our country and our world when women are not well represented in the news, and this reinforces gender stereotypes. Consider, for example, when girls constantly see men appear as experts in the news. What message is this sending to them? When almost all business and politics stories use men as experts, what kind of message does that send about how women are valued in the society that we live in? Second, I would argue that women reporters will sometimes choose stories that men might otherwise choose not to cover. Stories about the gender pay gap or stories about sexual harassment. These are stories men can and should cover as reporters, but more often than not, they're stories that are likely to be covered by women. So I would argue that we see less of these kinds of important stories when we have less women reporters, but also less women editors who often direct reporters on the news topics that they cover. Finally, being in the news is important for women's professional profiles. When men are always shown as experts, women lose important opportunities they might have otherwise had because they were seen as a recognised expert. For most professionals, it's very valuable if you can develop a public profile and be seen, be visible as an expert spokesperson. Too often women are missing this opportunity. Perhaps you can consider your position on my arguments or introduce new ones when you discuss this lecture pod in your class. So what can be done to correct this gender imbalance in the news? Here are some possibilities I would suggest. They include having women-owned and run media, having government funding for women's media, quotas for women on media boards, and far more controversial, we could look at content censorship policies that might work to prevent cultural biases and to promote gender equality. Perhaps you can come up with your own suggestions in class. Summing up, women are poorly represented in the news in Australia in terms of how frequently they appear as experts and, to a lesser degree, how frequently they appear as reporters as well. This poor representation is a persistent global trend, and it tells us we have gender biases in the news. Many Australian children recognise this gender bias. And finally, I argue that this gender bias impacts on the way we see women in Australia, while it contributes to particular perceptions and reinforces certain stereotypes. Thanks for listening, and I encourage you to explore the report and the data that I've mentioned in this lecture yourself by visiting the Global Media Monitoring Project website. Thank you.